"You're coming with me," the lonely rancher said to the woman who had been beaten for giving birth to triplet girls. Wyoming Territory. Late January 1877. High on the unforgiving ridges of the Snowhorn Mountains, the wind howled like a wounded beast, a sound that could strip the flesh from bone. But the first sound to catch Silas Granger's ear was not the wind. It was something smaller, more fragile, a sharp, high-pitched wail that sliced through the gale. He pulled his horse to a halt, the snow crunching like broken glass under its hooves, and tilted his head toward the timberline. There it was again. A baby's cry. No, more than one. He narrowed his eyes and dismounted, his boots sinking ankle-deep with each heavy step. The path was a frozen scar cutting through the trees, untouched for days. He led his horse by the reins, listening, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The sound grew louder as he approached a small clearing where an old fence post stood half-rotted and half-buried in snow. And there she was, a woman, barely upright, cruelly bound to the post with barbed wire. Her arms were cinched behind her, the skin torn, her wrists weeping blood onto the pristine snow. Ice clung to her lashes and the edges of her hair. Her lips were cracked, her face as pale as death, save for the bruises blooming like violets across her cheekbones. At her feet lay 3 small bundles. Infants. Newborns, wrapped in what looked like the shredded remains of a nightgown. One whimpered weakly. The other 2 were terrifyingly still. The woman's head moved, a faint, agonizing motion. She was conscious, but only just. "Don't let them take my daughters," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Without hesitation, Silas dropped to one knee beside her. He pulled off his thick gloves and checked each of the babies. They were breathing, shallow, but steady. Their skin was cold, a deep, invasive cold that seeped into the bone. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice low, steady, and certain. She blinked slowly, as if the words had to travel a great distance to reach her. He took a knife from his boot and sliced through the barbed wire. It had bitten deep into her forearms, and blood welled where the rusted steel tore free. But she did not scream. She did not even flinch. As her legs gave out, he wrapped his arms around her waist, holding her steady. Her body was limp, heavy with exhaustion and blood loss. Silas scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. Then, one by one, he gathered the babies, tucking them inside his coat and securing them with a thick wool blanket from his saddle. They barely stirred. The wind picked up again, slicing across the open space. He shielded them all with his body as his horse nickered, its anxiety a palpable thing in the air. A half-mile back to his cabin, uphill, through the snow, he adjusted his grip on the woman, tightened the wrap on the infants, and whispered, not to her, not to the babies, but perhaps to the wind or to God, "You don't die here, not on my land." He mounted his horse with practiced care, settling her in front of him, the babies tucked between them. She weighed next to nothing. The infants were lighter than winter rabbits. Time was not their friend. The journey back was slow, the wind relentless, but Silas moved without pause. There was no time to ask who she was, or what demons had chased her into this frozen hell. There was only time enough to keep her alive. The cabin was dark when they arrived, the fire long dead. Silas kicked open the door, carried her straight inside, and laid her gently on a bed of quilts near the hearth. He placed the babies in a basket lined with rabbit pelts, then turned to stoke the fire, his hands, for now, not shaking. Outside, the snow continued to fall, a silent white shroud covering the tracks that led back to her place of pain. Inside, by the growing firelight, Silas worked. A stranger had been left to die, but not here, not on his land. The cabin was little more than 4 wooden walls and a sloped roof groaning under the weight of the snow, but it was dry. The fire Silas had kindled now crackled with defiant life, its warmth slowly pushing back the cold that clung to the corners of the room like a second skin. He moved with a practiced silence, hanging his soaked coat by the fire and peeling off his gloves to reveal calloused, cracked hands. The woman lay unconscious on a bed of piled wool blankets. Her lips were tinged with blue, her hands loosely wrapped in strips of linen. She had not stirred since they arrived. The babies, however, had begun to mewl, low, weak sounds, but they were the sounds of life. Silas filled an iron pot with goat's milk and placed it on the fire to warm. He set a small, pine-carved feeding spoon beside a tin bowl, then crossed to the woman. Her breathing was a shallow whisper. He dipped a cloth into a pail of warm water and began to gently clean the dried blood from her legs. The bruises were deep and cruel, purple-black swells that spoke of someone kicking her, hard and often. He worked with a tenderness that belied his rough appearance, his touch gentle as he cleaned and covered her again. When the milk was warm, he tested a drop on the back of his hand. He crouched beside the makeshift cradle where the smallest baby had begun to cry in earnest, thin, urgent whimpers. Her skin was warm to the touch, a good sign. With the spoon, Silas fed tiny sips of milk into the girl's mouth. She took it clumsily at first, then with a greedy desperation. He did the same for the other two, pausing only to paw their mouths and tuck the blankets closer. A faint sound from the bed drew his attention. The woman's eyelids fluttered. Her voice, when it came, was cracked and barely audible. "My name's Maribel. Maribel Quinn." Silas crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside her. "Silas," he said simply. Her lips moved again, but no sound followed. Her gaze drifted from his face to the babies, who now rested quietly in the fire's glow. One of them, the smallest, let out a tiny sneeze. Maribel's eyes flooded with tears, but she was too broken to sob. They were just a silent stream down her cracked cheeks. Silas rose and walked to a trunk at the back of the room. He pulled out a thick elk hide cloak lined with rabbit fur, folded it, and carefully placed it beneath the sleeping children, making their cradle warmer, softer. When he looked back, Maribel was watching him. He didn't speak, only gave her a slow nod, before returning to the hearth to add more wood. Sparks rose like fireflies and vanished into the smoke-stained rafters. Time passed in the quiet rhythm of the fire, the wind, and the shifting breaths of 4 souls returning from the edge of death. Later, as Silas tended the fire one last time before resting, he heard her voice again, firmer this time, not stronger, but certain. "You didn't leave us." He did not reply. He only sat by the fire, staring into the flames as the storm howled. The cold held at bay. For now. The storm outside had softened to a hush. Snow still fell, but the wind had died, leaving a heavy stillness that wrapped the cabin like a shroud. Inside, the fire glowed low and steady, casting flickers of gold across the rough-hewn walls. Maribel was propped against a mound of blankets. Color had returned to her face, though the bruises still bloomed beneath her skin like ink stains. Silas sat nearby, drawing a whetstone along a blade with slow, careful strokes. He hadn't asked a single question. Not who she was, not who had done this to her. That silence was its own form of kindness. "I was 17 when I married Joseph Quinn," Maribel said, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. "He was 34, rich, powerful. My father said I was lucky." Silas didn't look up. The scrape of steel on stone continued, a steady, rhythmic sound. "I thought I was lucky too," she went on. "He brought me to a big house with marble floors. I wore silk, but he never touched me like a husband should. Not kindly." She paused, her gaze falling on the sleeping babies. "He frowned when the first girl was born. After the second, he stopped speaking to me. After the third," her voice cracked. Silas finally looked up, his eyes calm and steady. "Waiting. He called the midwife a whore, said she had cursed my womb. He told his brothers I was no better than a mule if I couldn't give him a son. That night, they beat me." She turned her face slightly, revealing a faint, old scar along her jaw. "I thought he would kill me. Instead, he dragged me to that fence post, said if the snow didn't take me, I was meant to live. He called it justice." Her hands trembled. One reached instinctively toward her daughters. "They said girls are nothing but mouths to feed," she whispered. Silas set the blade down. His jaw flexed once, tightly. He stood, his boots silent on the wooden floor, and knelt beside her. He took her swollen, bruised hand as if it were made of glass, holding it gently in his large, weathered palm. His voice was low, certain. "Here," he said, meeting her gaze. "Your girls are the only thing worth feeding." Tears filled Maribel's eyes. This time she let them fall, silent messengers of grief and gratitude that mixed with the firelight. Silas remained kneeling beside her, his presence a quiet, grounding anchor. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. It wasn't just warmth. It was something deeper, something that looked like the start of a promise. The snow began to melt around the cabin's edges, turning white drifts to gray slush and revealing patches of frozen earth. Spring was waking the mountains, and with the thaw came word from the lowlands. The knock came just after dawn. Silas opened the door to a woman in a green wool shawl, her breath fogging in the crisp air. "Morning, Silas," she said, her voice urgent. "Hattie," he greeted, stepping aside. "Come in." Maribel sat near the fire, one of the babies in her arms. Hattie gave her a quick, worried glance before turning back to Silas. "It's about her," she said, her voice low. "Joseph Quinn has put out word. He's telling folks she ran off in a fit, that she's unstable. Says the babies are his by right, and she's keeping them from him against the law." Maribel's eyes widened, her fingers tightening around her child. "He's hired men," Hattie continued. "4 of 'em. Says they're just looking to bring a mother home. But the way they ride, it ain't a rescue party." Silas nodded once. That was all. Hattie looked between them. "I rode up as soon as I heard. They'll find this place. And when they do, they won't take her," Silas said, his voice flat and final. Maribel looked up at him, her gaze unreadable. Hattie hesitated, then pulled a small leather pouch from her coat. "Dried lentils, jerky, and a flask of spirits. You'll need it." He accepted it with another silent nod. After she left, the day passed in quiet motion. Silas repaired the latch on the rear window, and reinforced the door with a second crossbar. He stacked firewood high, so Maribel wouldn't need to go outside. He moved supplies to the root cellar. He didn't speak. He sharpened his hunting knife until its edge gleamed like silver, then slid it into the sheath on his belt. The next morning, the air changed. It grew too quiet. The birds went silent. Then came the sound of hooves, 4 sets, crunching on the damp earth. Maribel clutched her daughters close. Silas opened the cabin door and stepped outside. The riders approached slowly, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. They reined in a few yards from the steps. The man in front, a scar tracing his cheek, rested a hand on the revolver at his hip. "Silas Granger," he called out. "We come with a claim." Silas said nothing. "That woman inside is Joseph Quinn's wife. She's his property. We've got every right to retrieve her and those girls." Silas stood still, arms loose at his sides, seemingly unarmed. His voice, when it came, was calm and clear. "She was never his, and she sure as hell ain't yours." The man sneered. "You think this is over, mountain man?" Silas didn't blink. "You want to test that? Come back and try." The riders stared, the silence stretching. Finally, the leader tugged on his reins. "Let's go," he barked to his men. "Not worth it today." They rode off, but their eyes promised they would return. Silas stood at the threshold for a long time after they had vanished. Inside, Maribel exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. They were safe for now, but the shadows from the lowlands were not done reaching for them. Spring unfurled across the mountainside, coaxing green buds from bare branches. The days stretched longer, and the cabin, once a refuge from death, began to feel like a home. Maribel moved with a quiet purpose, her steps steady, her hands sure. She cooked simple meals over the hearth, stews of wild onions and whatever Silas brought back from his hunts. The 3 babies, Eloise, Ruth, and June, grew stronger. Their cries softened from desperate wails to sweet chirps, like birds learning to sing. They slept in a row of soft nests made from coyote pelts and hay. Mornings were a quiet ritual. Maribel would rise before the sun to tend the fire and the girls. Silas would already be gone, hunting or checking traps, always returning before dusk. Their conversations were sparse, not from coldness, but from a shared language of silence. The past was a buried thing, left to the frost. One afternoon, Maribel found Silas at his workbench outside. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing weathered forearms as he worked a thin plank of cedar chunk with a carving knife. She watched in silence. He didn't look up, but he knew she was there. Later that night, she saw what he had made. Hung above the baby's resting place were 3 small wooden plaques, each no longer than a handspan. Carved into the fire-warmed wood were 3 names: Eloise, Ruth, June. Each letter had been smoothed and oiled, catching the light like a prayer. Maribel pressed her fingers to her lips. No one had ever carved her daughters' names into anything permanent. The days turned gold and green. Maribel began to sing to the girls in the evenings, soft lullabies from a forgotten childhood. Silas would sit by the door, his long frame leaned against the jamb, listening as he sharpened a tool or polished his rifle. One evening, as the air grew heavy with the smell of coming rain, Maribel was stirring a pot over the fire, humming softly. Without turning, without planning the words, she spoke his name, the full weight of it. Silas Granger. The room stilled. the soft sounds of the cabin, the crackle of the fire, the hum of her song, fell away. He turned to her slowly. His hands stopped moving. His eyes caught the firelight and held it, like embers waiting for breath. Maribel met his gaze, her own now steady and clear. "I never said thank you," she whispered. "Not properly." Silas rose, quiet as always, and stepped closer. He looked down at the bubbling pot, then at the girls sleeping peacefully behind her, and finally back into her eyes. "You didn't need to," he said, and in the long silence that settled between them, with the storm gathering outside and the warmth holding them safe within, it was enough. The silence between them wasn't awkward or unsure. It was simply full, heavy with everything that didn't need to be said, but was there all the same, living in the air, in the flicker of the fire, in the simple truth of their shared space. She smiled then, the smallest curve of her lips. It wasn't the kind of smile that meant everything was fixed, but the kind that promised something had begun. And Silas Granger, a man who had scarcely spoken 10 sentences a day since she'd met him, nodded once and returned to his seat. Outside, the wind gathered its strength. The air held the heavy promise of rain. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low and steady, and the quiet had never felt so much like peace. The storm rolled in just after dusk, a low, fast shadow sweeping across the mountain. It turned the wind cruel and the sky into a white, roiling fury. Snow slashed sideways against the cabin walls, thick enough to erase a man's tracks in minutes, wild enough to make him lose his way just steps from his own door. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed. The windows rattled in their frames. Silas stood by the back wall, checking the last of the shutters, while Maribel held Ruth and June close, her body a shield against the rising tension in the room. Beside the fire, Eloise slept on, blissfully unaware. Then Silas froze. He stepped to the window, brushed the frost away with the back of his knuckle, and peered into the blizzard's swirl. Figures. 3 of them. Horsemen, moving through the storm, their cloaks drawn tight and heads bowed against the wind. They moved slowly, deliberately, pushing against the mountain's resistance as if they owned it. Silas backed away from the window. "It's them," he said. Maribel's breath caught. She didn't need to ask who. One look at Silas's face told her everything. Joseph had found them. He turned to her, his voice low and urgent. "Take the girls. Follow the creek. Stay low. Do not stop. And don't you come back unless it's with the law." Her eyes widened, but before a protest could form on her lips, he was already in motion. He crossed to the corner, pulled out an old elk fur cloak, and wrapped it around her shoulders. He tucked a bundle of jerky dried apples and a small flask into her satchel. Then he unsheathed a small blade no longer than her hand and pressed its hilt firmly into her palm. "Keep this close. If they catch up, you do not hesitate." She stared at him, her mouth trembling. "What about you?" "I'll lead them the other way." He leaned down and kissed Eloise's head once, a quick, silent farewell. Then he met Maribel's eyes again. "Go, now." Maribel bundled the girls, 2 in her arms, 1 strapped to her back, and slipped out the rear door, vanishing into the trees. Silas watched it swing closed behind her. Then he went to work. He dragged a spare coat onto a broomstick, tying it to a fence post near the southern trail to create a decoy. He lit an oil lamp and tucked it behind a log, casting misleading shadows. He rode his own horse halfway down the trail, looping its reins to a tree as if it had been abandoned in haste. Finally, he lit a small fire just past the bend, just enough smoke to draw the eye, just enough heat to muddle a man's senses in the cold. Then he returned to the cabin and waited. The knock came minutes later, hard, unwelcome. Silas opened the door to find three men, snow-covered and grim. At their head stood Joseph Quinn. He hadn't changed much, still handsome in that cold, polished way. But his eyes were colder than the storm raging behind him. The storm passed, leaving its scars on the land, on skin, and in memory. In the quiet that followed, between two people who had nearly lost everything, a different kind of life began to take root. Silas's shoulder mended slowly. Maribel helped him bandage it each day with calm, steady hands. He never complained. She never fussed. Life had dealt them a cruel hand, but here they were, still breathing, still moving, still building something from the ruins. With the danger finally behind them, they rebuilt the cabin together. What had been a battered shelter for survival slowly became a home. Silas extended the east wall to make room for a larger hearth. Maribel painted the shutters a faded green, using leftover pigment from an old can Hattie had brought up from town. Soon, they opened their doors to travelers. There were always men on the trade trail. Fur trappers, timber haulers, ranch hands riding from one county to the next. Word spread that a hot stew and a safe night's sleep could be found near the ridge, just below the second switchback. They called it the hearth at Granger Ridge. Maribel cooked meals that warmed the stomach and softened the heart. Venison stew, root vegetable hash, and sweet cornbread with honey. Silas hunted, chopped wood, maintained the stables, and made sure trouble never crossed the porch. The three girls grew fast. Eloise walked first. Ruth's first word was fire. June sang before she could speak. Guests came and went, and with each passing day, laughter began to echo more often inside the cabin walls. One evening, after the last rider had departed and the girls were asleep, Maribel stepped out to find Silas on the porch, sanding down a rough board. He looked up and, without a word, reached into a leather satchel by his feet. He pulled out a shawl, thick and woven by hand, dyed a deep burgundy with dark thread embroidery. On one corner, in careful stitching, were three VA initials, PRJ, and beneath them, in all capital letters, Worthley. She took it without speaking, her fingers tracing the thread. Her breath hitched. "You made this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded. "For you," he said. "Because you are." He didn't finish, but he didn't have to. She swallowed hard, pulling the shawl tight against her chest. A pause hung between them, long and rich with unspoken feeling. Then she said it. "You chose us when you could have just walked away." Silas didn't answer with words. Instead, he stepped forward, took her hand gently, and looked into her eyes. There was no grand proposal, no declaration, just a quiet, unbreakable promise. That night, with the fire crackling and the mountains silent, they exchanged their vows, not with gold rings or a gathering of guests, but with soft voices and steady hearts. For the girls, Silas offered a string of carved beads he'd polished smooth and tied with twine, looping one over each of their tiny wrists as they slept. For Maribel, he offered nothing more than his hand. She took it, and in doing so took everything that mattered. There were no flowers, No priest, no music, just two people and a fire. And that was enough. Spring had fully claimed the mountain. The snow was long gone, replaced by soft moss and wild violets that curled along the stone path to the cabin. The scent of pine mingled with something warmer, wood smoke, wild herbs, and fresh bread from the hearth. Children's laughter rang across the yard as Eloise, Ruth, and June chased each other around the porch steps, their dresses stained with grass and joy. Maribel watched them from the kitchen window, her hands dusted with flour, a soft smile on her lips. The hearth at Granger Ridge had become more than a refuge. It was a quiet legend. Travelers came up the switchback trail, not just for food, but for peace, for something that felt like home, if only for a night. Silas spent most of his time out back, tending the garden rows he'd built by hand. When the girls napped, Maribel taught local children to read, some walking 5 miles for her lessons. Every night, the fire in the hearth was lit with care, not because they feared the cold, but because they had known it too well to ever forget its touch. One evening, Silas sat on the porch steps, boots dusted with earth, a basket of green beans beside him. The sun was sinking into the hills, casting the world in gold. Maribel came out with 2 mugs and sat beside him. The girls darted around the yard, giggling, barefoot, and gloriously alive. Maribel handed Silas his tea, then rested her hand on his. His fingers curled around hers, a light, familiar touch. She watched their daughters run wild beneath the setting sun, then turned to him, her voice soft. This fire between us, it never went out. Silas looked toward the horizon, the corners of his eyes crinkling. It just needed a place to live, he said. They sat like that for a long time, hand in hand, as the sky turned to lavender and the first stars began to blink into view. No one passing by would know the whole story, not the blood and the storm, the fear and the fight. But they would see the way she smiled, the way he watched her, and the way 3 little girls danced in a patch of mountain sunlight, and they would know that something powerful had been built here. Not from wealth, not from war, but from the stubborn, beautiful kind of love that survives the worst of winters and stays. Thank you for riding with us through this tale of fire, frost, and a love that refused to fade. In a land where justice was rare and warmth even rarer, Silas and Maribel proved that sometimes the strongest homes are built not from timber or stone, but from trust, from sacrifice, and from choosing each other when it would have been easier to walk away. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even in the harshest places, love can take root and grow, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable journeys into the heart of the American frontier, where bullets missed, but hearts didn't. Tap the bell so you never miss a story that just might stay with you forever.